Hey everybody, this is Vince Miller. Thank you so much for joining me for another devotional. Today we're going to be in John chapter 5. I'm going to read verses 8 through 10, which finish off the story of Jesus and this lame man. Jesus says to him, "Get up, take up your bed and walk." And at once, like that, the man was healed and he took up his bed and he walked. Pretty cool story. But here comes the bad part. Now that day was the Sabbath. So the Jews said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath. It is not lawful for you to take up your bed." There's always a wet blanket out there somewhere, isn't there? So as we begin, I want you to note today that Jesus was not violating a law of God by healing this man on the Sabbath day, but he was violating a religious interpretation of the law. Jewish religious leaders had established certain oral traditions or oral laws to, well, help interpret the law of God at times. This was their attempt to define laws that were open to some interpretation. Thus, these oral traditions, you might think of them as customs, had become a way of legislating obedience. We commonly call that today legalism. Now, in this instance, Jesus healed on the Sabbath. And the Sabbath was a day of rest to Jews where work was not to be done, as stated by the fourth of the 10 commandments. But within that commandment or law, words like rest and work were open to some interpretation. Now, you might say, what kind of interpretation? Well, for example, some people would ask, how much rest should or should not be done? Or how much work should or should not be done on the Sabbath? Therefore, Jewish oral laws were actually written to help guide this interpretation. And in this instance, a man carrying anything that weighed more than 2 figs, so 2 pieces of fruit or vegetable, was considered a violation of this commandment. Therefore, that's what this guy is doing. He's carrying more than 2 figs. But for just a moment, instead of being so condescending to these laws, I want you to assume that these oral laws, and there were 613 of them, by the way, were initially written to help followers walk more carefully in obedience to God. Just initially assume that, okay? But like any form of legislation, these behavioral requirements can be used in a legalistic way eventually, right? They can become tools to control the behavior of others. Therefore, in this instance, they can miss the spirit of the law, and instead of driving people closer to God, they drive them further away from Him. So, while Jesus has just liberated, in an incredible event, a lame man from 4 decades of incapacitation, his liberation is not met with celebration because of Jewish religious legalism. And Jesus knows exactly what he's done. His command was to take up your bed and walk. And this was in direct attack and violation of the legalism that missed the spirit of the 4th commandment in the law, which is to simply take a rest from work, not to take a rest from doing good to fellow brothers and celebrating that with them. Now, I really believe legalism is a problem for everyone, every denomination and every church and every family, by the way, and every leader. Religious legalism, or the attempt to legislate behavior to get the results we want, will always eventually drive people further from God, every single time. It might even keep us from seeing the miracles that God wants to do and celebrating them when they happen and enjoying their pleasure. So, if you've been a little bit of a crab or a crank or a curmudgeon lately, maybe it's time for you to evaluate where that is all coming from. Why do you have that spirit lately? Because I want you to know this. God is doing all kinds of incredible things. We've been seeing it down in Asbury University. Incredible things that God is doing. But you might be missing out on them all because you have this legalistic attitude in your heart. So address that today. If you've been a crab lately, try to figure out where that's coming from. It might be coming from a legalistic attitude. And bring that to God and ask Him to free you from it, so you can celebrate Him. I love you guys. I pray this blesses you today. If it has, share it with someone else. And I'll see you right back here again tomorrow.